Michael Turner checked into the Crestline Hotel under a name that wasn't his, carrying a battered suitcase filled not with clothes but with wires, timers, and sketches that revealed the mind of a man preparing for something unthinkable. The Crestline Hotel sat quietly on the edge of the city's business district, a place that had built a reputation for being reliable but unremarkable. Its lobby was lined with beige walls, artificial plants in corner pots, and a faint scent of coffee that never seemed to fade. Business travelers chose it for its proximity to the freeway, families liked it for the indoor pool, and staff came to work knowing their shifts would be predictable. On that particular autumn evening, nothing appeared out of place. Cars pulled in and out of the lot, guests rolled their suitcases across the tiled floor, and the receptionist behind the desk greeted each new arrival with the same practiced smile. Amid the flow of travelers was a man who drew little attention. He arrived on foot, carrying a scuffed duffel bag in one hand and a wheeled suitcase in the other. He moved quickly as though he wanted to pass unnoticed, and when he reached the front desk, he gave a name that would later prove to be false. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, and his eyes darted around the lobby as if searching for exits rather than admiring the decor. The clerk assigned him a room on the 8th floor and slid a keycard across the counter. Within minutes, he had vanished into the elevator, leaving behind only the faint smell of cigarettes on his coat. To anyone else, he looked like a man on a business trip or perhaps someone stopping over between destinations. But inside his suitcase were no clothes neatly folded, no toiletries, no signs of an ordinary traveler. Instead, there were bundles of wires, small metal containers, and scraps of handwritten notes filled with calculations. Every item had been carefully packed and hidden, each piece serving a purpose in a plan that had been forming for weeks, maybe months. The hotel staff had no reason to suspect anything, and other guests were far too busy with their own lives to notice a stranger blending into the crowd. After he entered his room, he locked the door and closed the curtains tightly, shutting out the view of the city. The soft hum of the air conditioner filled the silence while he unpacked his belongings. He laid items out on the bed in a careful arrangement, his movements precise, as though this was not the first time he had rehearsed what he was about to do. On the desk by the window, he placed the first sign that something was wrong came quietly, almost by accident. A housekeeper, making her evening rounds, knocked on the door of the 8th floor room. There was no answer, but she noticed the Do Not Disturb sign had been hanging on the knob since the man checked in. Some guests preferred privacy, so she moved on, but curiosity lingered. Later, when she returned with fresh towels, she caught a glimpse through the partially open door as the man slipped into the hallway for ice. Inside, just visible on the edge of the bed, were thick black wires spilling from an unzipped bag. To her, it looked unusual enough to mention, though she wasn't certain what she had seen. She quietly told the front desk. The manager at first dismissed it, suggesting it was probably electronic equipment. But her insistence made him uneasy. He decided to call a security officer to take a closer look. By the time they approached the 8th floor, the man had already returned to his room and secured it with a latch. From behind the door came no sound, just silence that felt heavier the longer they stood there. Not wanting to cause a scene in front of other guests, the manager retreated to his office and dialed the local police. What followed was a slow but deliberate shift from routine hotel operations to a full-scale emergency. Within the hour, plainclothes officers entered through a side door and began their quiet assessment. They spoke with the staff, interviewed the housekeeper, and then positioned themselves discreetly in the hallways. Guests nearby were politely asked to move to lower floors. At first, many assumed it was a minor disturbance, perhaps a medical situation or a guest refusing to pay a bill. But as the officers' presence grew, whispers began to spread among the hotel's occupants. Something serious was unfolding. It didn't take long for investigators to confirm their fears. Through surveillance footage, they saw the man entering the building earlier in the evening. He carried not only the duffel bag but also smaller packages tucked into his coat. Combined with the report of wires, their concern escalated. They knocked on the door and identified themselves, but the man refused to open. Moments later, a handwritten note was slid out from beneath the door. Its message was blunt. He was armed with explosives and would not leave willingly. That single note transformed the situation instantly. Police called for backup, and the hotel was placed in partial lockdown. Additional guests were quietly evacuated through side stairwells, while others were told to remain in their rooms and stay away from windows. Outside, patrol cars blocked off the street, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the pavement. Within an hour, local news crews had gathered, pointing cameras toward the hotel entrance, unsure of what exactly was happening inside. For those still in the building, tension grew heavier with each minute. The normal sounds of hotel life, the distant hum of elevators, the shuffle of feet on carpet, the chatter of televisions behind closed doors were drowned out by the knowledge that danger sat just a few floors above them. On the 8th floor, the man had fortified himself, and with each passing hour, the realization spread that this was not going to end quickly. By the time darkness settled over the Crestline Hotel, the building no longer felt like a resting place for weary travelers. The lobby was still lit, the desk clerks still present, but the energy had shifted. Guests whispered in corners, police radios crackled near the stairwells, and the hum of ordinary hotel life had been replaced with a sharp edge of unease. Outside, flashing lights reflected off the glass facade, drawing curious onlookers who stood behind the barricades lining the street. From a distance, it appeared like a movie set, but for those inside, it was reality unfolding in real time. On the 8th floor, the man remained sealed in his room. The door had been reinforced with furniture dragged from the space, creating a barricade that slowed any attempt to force entry. Negotiators made repeated efforts to reach him, their voices steady through the crackle of a loudspeaker. They promised him safety if he surrendered, tried to appeal to reason, and reminded him of the lives around him. Each time, his responses came in the form of scrawled notes slipped under the door, as though he could not bear to speak directly. The notes were troubling lists of demands that ranged from absurd to impossible. One page demanded a helicopter waiting on the roof. Another insisted on untraceable money in a duffel bag. Most bizarrely, several names appeared, people no one in law enforcement had records of, names that may have existed only in his imagination. The officers outside his door quickly realized they were dealing with someone unstable, someone whose grasp on reality was slipping. What made the situation more dangerous was his knowledge of explosives. Investigators learned that he had once worked in demolition, a job that gave him the skills to build devices capable of destruction. In his notes, he boasted of what he had constructed, describing circuits, triggers, and a timer that could bring the building down if pushed. Whether or not he was exaggerating, no one could afford to take the risk. As the hours ticked by, the atmosphere inside the hotel grew heavier. Guests who had not yet been evacuated were confined to their rooms. Some crouched in bathrooms, listening through walls for the sound of footsteps. Parents held children close, trying to explain away the strange noises and the distant commands shouted by police. Staff members, once focused on room service orders and laundry deliveries, were now huddled in storage rooms waiting for instructions. The entire building felt frozen in suspense, as though time itself was holding its breath. Outside, reporters speculated on live broadcasts, their cameras aimed at the glowing windows of the upper floors. Every shadow that passed was scrutinized, every movement magnified into something significant. The longer the standoff dragged on, the more the crowd swelled, a mixture of curiosity seekers and worried families who knew loved ones were trapped inside. Inside the barricaded room, the man's behavior shifted as the night wore on. At times he seemed methodical, shuffling his belongings, rearranging his equipment. At other moments, he scribbled frantically on scraps of paper, his handwriting jagged and uneven, as if panic were seeping into his resolve. He stopped responding to the negotiators for long stretches, leaving officers guessing whether he was preparing to follow through on his threats. The silence itself became its own weapon, a reminder that at any second he could act. The standoff had entered its most dangerous stage. Patience was thinning on both sides. Law enforcement weighed their options carefully, knowing one wrong move could trigger disaster. And yet, within the walls of the Crestline Hotel, one man held the balance of every life inside, his intentions unclear, his actions unpredictable, and his presence turning an ordinary night into a nightmare that had no clear end in sight. Just after midnight, the tension inside the Crestline Hotel reached a breaking point. The night had been long and grueling, the hours stretching like elastic for everyone involved. Guests huddled in their rooms, listening to distant footsteps in the hallways and the low hum of police radios. Officers outside the barricaded 8th floor room had been on high alert, their training keeping them steady even as adrenaline coursed through their veins. Then, without warning, a muffled explosion shattered the uneasy calm. The building trembled, and the sharp sound of breaking glass and crumbling plaster filled the air. Smoke began to pour from the windows on the 8th floor, dark and thick, curling downward like a living thing. Chaos erupted immediately, fire alarms blared, echoing off the walls, and the smell of smoke seeped into every corridor. Guests, already on edge, now scrambled in panic, some rushing toward stairwells while others hesitated, uncertain which way to move. Staff directed them as best they could, shouting instructions over the din of alarm bells and cracking plaster. Outside, emergency vehicles had already lined the streets, and firefighters rushed toward the building with hoses and axes, assessing the situation with practiced urgency. When the smoke cleared slightly, officers were able to peer through the shattered windows. The scene on the 8th floor was one of devastation. Furniture lay overturned, papers scattered, and the walls were pocked with debris from the explosion. Amid the wreckage, they saw the man, the architect of the standoff, lying motionless. For a tense few minutes, responders feared the worst, but it soon became apparent that the damage had been concentrated within his own room. The structure of the hotel had held, sparing other floors from destruction. The explosion, horrifying as it was, had not spread beyond the 8th floor. Investigators would later examine the scene in painstaking detail. They found that the man had built a device designed to maximize attention rather than to destroy the building entirely. Wires had been meticulously arranged to create a loud, destructive effect in a contained space, a statement of defiance that stopped short of mass casualties. The discovery of the device, combined with evidence of careful planning, painted a picture of a man consumed by a need to be noticed to make a final, dramatic impression. Inside the building, survivors were shaken but unharmed. Guests who had been sheltering in place slowly began to emerge from their rooms, faces pale and eyes wide. Firefighters and officers guided them down stairwells, away from smoke and debris, and medical personnel attended to anyone who had suffered minor injuries from falling objects or the force of the blast. The atmosphere remained tense, every creak of the building a reminder that the danger had not fully passed. As dawn approached, the immediate threat ended, but the impact of the event lingered. News crews streamed footage of the wrecked 8th floor room, the shattered windows, and the scorched walls. Investigators combed through the remains, reconstructing the timeline of the explosion, tracing the man's movements, and piecing together the motives behind his actions. For the city, it was a night that defied expectation, a sudden plunge from ordinary life into chaos, all triggered by one man's careful, destructive design. The morning after the explosion, the city awoke to a mixture of disbelief and relief. News outlets covered the story non-stop, their headlines labeling the incident the Crestline Hotel standoff or the hotel bomber. Streets around the hotel remained cordoned off as investigators continued to comb through debris, documenting every detail, from fragments of wiring to scraps of paper that might offer a clue to the man's motives. Crowds of curious onlookers lingered behind barricades, whispering and speculating, some recognizing the hotel as a place they had passed countless times without a second thought. Authorities began piecing together the suspect's history. He had lived a life that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. Colleagues described him as quiet, reserved, and somewhat withdrawn. Records showed financial instability, unpaid debts, and a series of personal setbacks, including a divorce that left him isolated. Investigators found journals and notebooks in his destroyed room, filled with detailed calculations, notes on explosives, and cryptic entries about feeling ignored and overlooked by the world. What became clear was that the standoff had been more than a desperate act. It had been the culmination of months, maybe years, of planning. Psychologists and law enforcement profilers who reviewed the case concluded that the man's actions reflected a need for control in a life that had spiraled beyond his influence. The detonation of the device inside his own room was both symbolic and tragic. It drew attention, ensured his story would be told, and ended with only his life lost. There were no other casualties, a fact that mystified many and suggested that, despite his destructive intent, he had drawn a boundary around what he was willing to risk. The Crestline Hotel itself faced months of recovery. Floors were repaired, walls repainted, and windows replaced. Staff returned gradually, many carrying the weight of the night's events. They remembered the fear in guests' eyes, the frantic movements through smoke-filled corridors, and the strange silence that had followed the explosion. Though the hotel reopened, it never quite felt the same. Every creak in the hallway or flicker of a light reminded them of the danger that had once loomed so close. For guests who had experienced it firsthand, a routine stay at the hotel became impossible to forget. As investigations continued, the media and the public struggled to make sense of the man's actions. Some viewed it as a final act of revenge against a world that had ignored him. Others saw it as a calculated cry for recognition, a dramatic statement engineered to ensure that his name would not be forgotten. Interviews with law enforcement and psychologists painted a portrait of someone isolated, meticulous, and ultimately tragic, a man who had allowed his frustration and despair to transform into destruction. In the end, the story of the Crestline Hotel standoff became a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that ordinary places can become extraordinary in a terrifying way, and that human behavior can be both unpredictable and devastating. While the man's life ended in fire and smoke, the questions he left behind lingered far longer. Authorities and citizens alike were left to grapple with why someone could feel so unseen, so unheard, and so compelled to make a final, violent statement. The night's events became a permanent scar on the city, a memory that refused to fade, carrying a lesson about the fragility of normalcy and the consequences of unchecked desperation.